Good evening. Sarah Piccini is the Assistant Director at the Lackawanna Historical Society. She received a master's degree in history from the University of Scranton in 2010, and her recent research has focused on anniversary events, the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, as well as what made Scranton a suffragette city. Sarah is a former board member of the PA Anthracite Heritage Museum and currently serves as the business secretary for the Pennsylvania Historical Association. Would you join me in welcoming Sarah?
Thank you, Kathleen, and thank you for inviting me to come here for Women's History Month. I am the Assistant Director of the Lackawanna Historical Society. I've been there for almost 10 years. This is a program I developed maybe 4 years ago. It is one of my favorite things to do. It's not exactly serious history, but it's a great deal of fun. It comes with ruffles and lace. So unfortunately, gentlemen, it is all about women's clothing. So if you could just bear with me for a little while. Men's clothing traditionally after about 1812 or so is kind of boring. So I'm focusing primarily on women's clothing. And I brought with me some items from our collection. I have one that I have to pass around as a photo. To help me kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. The handouts that I passed around earlier kind of illustrate a little bit of what I'm talking about, some of the silhouettes that I'll be discussing, so you have an idea of what I'm talking about, not having to rely on movie references that I make for them. But primarily what I'm focusing on is the Victorian era. The Victorian era stretched from 1837 through 1901. That was the reign of Queen Victoria. The United States went a little bit further into the early 1900s, just for the difference in time that it takes fashions to catch on or to change, coming from England to the United States. So lasted a little bit longer. I'm also going to push it a little bit farther into the 1920s or so. So to give you kind of an overview of what I'm talking about, picture Scarlett O'Hara all the way through the Titanic, through Downton Abbey, up to Miss Fisher, or any other flapper you could think of. That's the kind of the scope of what I'll be covering. Most of what I have with me are earlier Victorian era pieces, primarily the undergarments. We do have the outer garments, the fashions from mostly from Lackawanna County, that stretch from 1835 through the 1970s or so. I didn't bring the Civil War era outer dress with me. We have several of them. They're just a little too fragile to keep doing for show and tell. The undergarments are a little sturdier, and you also generally don't see them on display. But in this general period I'm talking about, there was a huge amount of change that took place. The Industrial Revolution changed everything, pretty much, from how people lived, to where they lived, to what they were wearing, to how easily accessible it was. The Industrial Revolution also created what was called the middling sort, as the middle class. This was a group of people between laborers and people who owned wherever they were laboring. All of a sudden you needed government bureaucrats to handle the increasing bureaucracy. You needed shop owners and store clerks. You needed railroad agents and all kind of other middling people in between. So it created an entirely new class system, basically. Also in 1851 is the first time the word housewife appears as an actual term. It first appeared in the British Census in 1851. So before that you were just the wife of whoever. Now you could be a housewife. So you had an actual title. But primarily what I'm talking about is the silhouette and how it changed. It may look like there wasn't really all that much of a change, but if you were following fashion, if you were into it, you knew what the difference was. Wealthier women, it was easier for them to get new styles every year. Otherwise, you had to kind of make do. You could update or modify the cut or the design or the details of a dress to kind of stretch them into the next season if you didn't have the money to afford new clothing every year. They said if you know what you're looking at, one of our volunteers who manages our fashion collection, Bridget Conlon, was a few years ago in London with her husband at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and came home furious that they had a dress marked 1863 when it was clearly 1864. I was like, Bridget, I think the V&A knows what they're talking about. I do. I think you might want to let them go on this. But there are differences if you know. If not, it's just all pretty. But there was also a huge architectural structure that enabled you to dress like that. It wasn't exactly easy. This was the era of wealthy women who had ladies' maids who helped them get dressed. As you'll see as I'm going through this, there was an awful lot of steps rather than just getting out of bed and pulling something over your head. It was a tremendous amount of work. Good thing they didn't really do much else other than get dressed and go out. There wasn't time to do anything else, really, once you really got into it. I'm focusing primarily on the clothing of wealthier women, primarily just because it lasted. That's what was saved. What we have in our collection at the Historical Society are mostly, we have an awful lot of ball dresses. We have ball gowns, we have wedding dresses. We have the pretty fluffy examples of things. We don't have a lot of everyday work clothes. They were worn until they were worn out, or they were repurposed. They weren't saved and preserved. So what we have is primarily the kind of stellar examples of what you're wearing at the time. So let's see. It was getting easier and easier with the Industrial Revolution to dress like this. Mass production made it easy to get corsets, to get petticoats, to get crinolines. You could get machine-made lace rather than something that was hand-tatted or hand-crocheted. It was easier and easier to be stylish. Even if you were making your own clothes, in 1851, the first sewing machine came out. So you weren't necessarily sewing everything by hand, although you still could if you wanted to. If you were following fashions, primarily you were relying on Godey's Ladies' Book or Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, the Ladies' Home Journal, who had text descriptions of a pattern. There was a color plate illustration of what the stylish silhouette was with all the details, and then there was like a paragraph or so that said, use gold ribbon to outline this. And you had to know what you were doing. You had to know how to sew. You had to have an idea of what they meant when they said attach this to this and replace this with this. But in 1863, Butterick introduced the first full-size patterns. So if you sew and you follow a regular pattern that you cut out, they first appeared in 1863. So that made it even easier. You didn't really have to know as much about how to piece a garment together in order to create one yourself. If you didn't want to sew, it was also easier and easier now to buy things ready-made. Marshall Fields opened the first department store in 1853 in Chicago, R.H. Macy in New York in 1858, John Wanamaker in Philadelphia in 1877, and the Sears Roebuck catalog first hit doorsteps in 1892. So you could buy ready-made things that were fashionable. We have copies at the Historical Society of, I think it's the 1897 Sears Roebuck catalog. A dress kind of in the style of the full skirted dresses. I think in the 1897 catalog were like $4.50 to buy one. Again, it was also 1897, so nothing else cost that much, but they were relatively affordable. You were looking at something that was 3 months' wages or something. They were relatively affordable to buy ready-made clothing. If you were making them yourselves, you needed vast amounts of material. To make a dress like that required about 20 yards of fabric. They were silks, they were velvets, they were heavier fabrics or woolens, but you needed about 20 yards, mostly for the skirt. Fabric was also woven much narrower than it is today. If you sew, the standard fabric width is about 45 inches. You can get pieces that are wider. Fabric through the mid 1800s was about 20 inches, so it was considerably narrower. So you needed more to work with in general. Also at the time was the beginning of chemical dyes. In 1856, there was a British chemist named William Perkin. He was 18 years old. He was working in his father's attic laboratory. He was trying to produce synthetic quinine from coal tar, and he accidentally invented purple. So kind of a happy accident. It was called Perkins Purple. It was a mauve color. It was the first more or less color-fast, bright chemical dye. Before then, people had relied primarily on vegetable dyes or mineral dyes. They were either expensive or just produced kind of a pretty pastel, but nothing really bright. An earlier color before then that was very popular, also one of my favorite stories, in the 1770s that stretched into about the 1850s, it was still used, was a color called Scheele's green or Paris green. It was a very bright emerald green color. It was unfortunately wildly toxic as it was distilled from copper arsenate. The cartoon that I have on the bottom of the handout is the arsenic waltz. If your dress was wet from rain or perspiration, the arsenic would leach into your skin. This was not a beneficial thing to have happen. Although you looked lovely, you were going to die. The color was also used for wallpaper and for home goods. Wolf flocked wallpaper used it a lot. If you brushed against it, the arsenic grains would just sort of drift off. So if you read or watch a lot of period movies or books, see people, they go to the country to take the air. Their houses were poisoning them, but they looked nice. So so we kind of stopped using that color as other less poisonous chemical colors became available. Like I said, Perkins Purple in 1856 was the first really good chemical dye. So dresses at the time also became more colorful. It was not uncommon to combine a whole bunch of wild patterns, and you would have stripes and plaids and kind of look like a clown, but an affluent, wealthy clown, so it was okay. But the risk of poisoning from your arsenic dress aside, the elaborate structure that maintained the shape of these things did serve a dual purpose. It held the wobbly bits in place and gave you the structure that was fashionable, but it also provided protection for your outer clothing. Even wealthy women at the time would still have maybe 10 dresses for the season, more likely 4 or 5. And if you had a lot of things underneath them, you didn't sweat onto your dress. This was the time when laundry was still required boiling water and lye. If most of your clothing was silk or velvet or wool, you weren't washing it that often. So having several layers underneath protected your outer garments as well. There were most things that you see are white. There were black undergarments as well, primarily to be worn during a mourning period. But as we know, black clothing hides a lot of sins. So it was less picky to have. If you had black undergarments, white was really easy to soak and bleach. So it was relatively easy to maintain. But let's see, the beginning of the Victorian era I'm going to start talking about kind of marks that transition from a higher empire waist to a dropped waist with a full skirt. The dresses of this era were primarily 2 pieces. It was the bodice and the skirt were two separate pieces. As the skirts got wider and wider and wider, you needed increasing layers of petticoats to achieve that fullness. But as you were getting dressed, as you needed more and more and more, how did you fit them all? Where did you go with that? Ironically, corsets play a huge part in petticoats. I happen to have one. It is itty bitty. This is an 1840s corset. No, it does not fit me. But this is an 1840s corset, single line of lacing up the back. And they're generally kind of scorned today as these awful rib-cracking, organ-displacing torture things. But they did actually serve a purpose. They functioned, again, to hold in the wobbly bits, held up the bodice of your dress, but it also created a fashionably tiny waist that also kind of served as a shelf to hold the weight of all the petticoats that you were wearing. It was an easy way to, rather than have lots and lots of layers, it made a kind of a shelf to hang petticoats on. At the time, the idea of a fashionable waist was roughly 20 inches. This is 20 inches. Women were advised to not cinch their corsets to more than or less than 27 inches. which is, still skinnier than I am. This is 27 inches. The fashionable waist, again, is 20. This corset that I have is 20 inches. Not terrible, upside down. Not cinched in, this is 20 inches. So you would have been more or less expected to fit into this. Fools! They didn't have mozzarella sticks. But it was kind of a step up in the idea of how you were getting dressed. The corsets themselves were muslin or cotton. They were lined originally with whalebone, later with pieces of steel rods. There was a busk down the center. You could tell. There's a wider piece down the middle that had a channel that held a wide, flat busk, kind of like a ruler almost, but not quite as wide. That would hold the entire structure in place. Corsets do give you tremendous posture. You cannot bend down, however, so you sort of had to do this rather graceful sink down. There was no need to stick your bottom in the air like a strumpet. So they did kind of change how you moved, obviously. We have, again, I'm going to keep using Bridget as an example. We have a group of volunteers who do period costuming. A lot of it is Civil War. And I know they have said after the ball is over, it takes a little while for their stomach to go back into shape. It does sort of rearrange you as you're wearing them. But they did kind of, again, serve that purpose. There was also, because they were Victorian and uptight about these things, there were also pregnancy corsets. Rather than just having a single line of lacing down the back, there are laces up the side and up the front to disguise being in a delicate condition. To go with a corset, underneath the corset, you would start with the chemise underneath it. Kind of looks like a nightgown. This was the first layer that you would put on. The corset would go on top of that. The chemise would protect your skin from being poked by the stabby bits of your corset. Like if the underwire comes through on your bra. And then on top of a corset, obviously you needed a corset cover. This is an especially pretty version. We do have some that look more or less like a sleeveless blouse with a collar and buttons. They were more practical. This may have been like a wedding version. Again, I bring the pretty bits rather than the everyday ones. So that would have gone on top of the corset. And it was acceptable to have the lace trim up here over the top of your bodice. That's partly why they were designed that way. Corsets as shelves, in the end, had their limitations for the amount of stuff you could hang. And as skirts got wider and wider and wider, rather than wearing 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 petticoats, this is a relatively everyday version. But again, it is still pretty. They are kind of highly designed. This one has pin tucks and handmade lace. This one is a much later version, 1905. It has a train, but I want to wear it to a garden party, so I bring it with me all the time. But it's several layers of lace with threading space through the middle to put a ribbon through. But if you were trying to create that full skirted look, you would have, again, required 5 or 6, depending on what you were trying to affect. Eventually, they got to be so ridiculous and cumbersome, they were replaced with cage crinolines. Unfortunately, I didn't bring our crinoline because it is already on display at the Catlin House. So I have a picture. This I swiped from the Metropolitan Museum, from their costume collection. They look, if you grow tomatoes, kind of like the cage that you get to support your tomatoes. They were made of flexible wires held together with linen or other kind of twill fabric tapes, and they were collapsible. They do collapse down to something flat, and they are flexible. But they did prevent you from having to wear many petticoats. You would have just done one underneath, one on the crinoline, and then one more on top. There were different versions of cage crinolines. The more wire rims that there were, the more flat the silhouette was, I guess. If there were less rims, you could see the spaces in between. It just wasn't as smooth of a look. So there were, again, versions for working women, for upper class women, depending on what you could afford. There were different versions of them. They didn't entirely eliminate the need for petticoats. You only needed one over top to kind of hide that ribbed look. Again, kind of problematic slightly. If you're wearing a skirt that's that wide, you kind of lose the sense of where you are in space. This was when everything was lit by fires and candlelight. You became a giant chimney, unfortunately. It did create a bit of an updraft. There are many stories of women catching on fire, brushing unknowingly against a fire. They didn't know they were on fire until they were, unfortunately. So they were a bit of a problem. But also, on the other hand, the same effect did create kind of like air conditioning. It does make a draft. If you're in the South in the summer at a reenactment, see women kind of swaying back and forth in hoop skirts, makes a nice draft. So it does kind of work as long as you're not against open fire. But that was kind of the basis of that huge tea cozy kind of silhouette. But again, that wasn't all you're wearing. Underneath that, you would have started with pantaloons. Because my mother is watching Gone with the Wind now. Right at the very beginning, when Scarlett is at the picnic, and they go to take a nap, and she's running around in her little chemise and her pantaloons. These are the things. They were the underlayer. Later in the 1900s, they were replaced by split drawers that are split. The reason they are split like this, if you were wearing all of these layers, you weren't picking them all up to go to the bathroom. You just sort of squatted down. Also, chamber pots. It was very easy. Not very ladylike, but it's a lot to pick up. Remember going to the prom in high school and having to hold somebody's dress. This is it's still a thing that happens. But it was the fashionable silhouette. Again, nothing was ever worn as a single layer. There were always layers on layers on layers on layers. One of the best descriptions comes from I think it's 1890, from 1890 fashion magazine, that said, "When we see engravings of ladies with skirts like old-fashioned tea cozies, we're apt to think of the structure as solid and immovable, but, of course, nothing could be further from the truth. The crinoline was in a constant state of agitation, thrown from side to side. It was rather like a restless captive balloon, and not at all, except in shape, like the igloo of the Eskimos. It swayed now to one side, now to another, tipped up, swung forward and backward. Any pressure on one side of the steel hoops was transferred to the other side and resulted in a certain upward shooting of the skirt. It was probably this action which gave mid-Victorian men their complex about ankles. If you were otherwise so well dressed, the only thing you could see maybe was your ankle. They were very sexy. But it also led to a change, of course, in footwear. Earlier women, other way. Civil War era women primarily were wearing slippers like these. These are wedding shoes. They do have a little tiny heel on them. They're incredibly narrow. They were worn by an adult and not a really big-footed child. But this is primarily the shoe style through around the 1880s or so. You were wearing slippers like this. They were silk, they were satin. Heavier ones would have been like a brocade or a velvet. They weren't terribly useful outside, but you really weren't going outside all that much. So this was primarily the style earlier. As the skirts got wider with more chances for wardrobe malfunctions, ushered in the era of those fabulous Victorian high button boots. Again, white, probably wedding, not really as common as the black or the brown styles. Earlier ones had the buttons up the side. They later switched to laces that are much easier to deal with. But you went from slippers to boots, so you can't see those ankles. As everything is connected. As the shape of the crinoline and the skirts changed after the 1860s, it moved from that rounded dome shape on the sheet to a more conical silhouette later, and then switched around to a bustle. By the 1870s, switched from a crinoline to a bustle. I do happen to have one of those. This is one of the bustles that we have, in our collection. It's a wire frame. The other one that we have is like a little muslin bag that has 3 big like pin springs in it. It's bizarre. But it would have gone, let me get this caught on something, would have gone around your waist and held your skirts out in the back. Created a silhouette kind of like a centaur. I think that the dresses are lovely. The silhouette itself is slightly absurd. And in this kind of a narrow period, it changed a great deal. You were still using, if you were making clothing, you were still using the same amount of fabric. You were still using that 20 yards or so. It was just shaped and draped differently. Rather than having one solid circle skirt, these dresses after the 1870s went into more of a 2-piece kind of style. There was a straight underskirt and then an apron or an overskirt that was over it on the top, and usually had a longer train in the back. And they all would have been kind of hung or draped over a bustle. Sometimes there were dresses that had bustles in them already. One of my favorite things that I actually just put away at the Catlin House is an 1880 wedding dress from a little tiny skinny thing that has a bustle built right into it. So it's all one piece, but does have that magnificent sort of curve on the back of it. And it is built in as well. Also at the time in this same era, dresses started to become 1 piece rather than 2 pieces. They're often using princess seams down the front to kind of pull in the waist a little bit. They were still using all kind of different designs and everything. 1876 Fashion Magazine reported it is now impossible to describe dresses with any exactitude. The skirts are draped so mysteriously, the arrangement of trimmings is usually one-sided, and the fastenings are so curiously contrived that if I study any particular toilette for even a quarter of an hour, the task of writing how it is all made remains hopeless. But then by the 1890s, bustles were gone. They were replaced with bell-shaped but slimmer skirts. Started to kind of move into something a little more reasonable, a little more common, a little more resembling what you might actually wear today. It doesn't seem totally ridiculous. This was the era of Gibson girls. At the time, also a lot of the skirts narrowed, the sleeves got more and more ridiculous. Generally, the kind of rule of thumb for looking at historical fashion, if the skirt was really wide, the sleeves were small. There's an inverse relationship between how much fabric it is and where it's going. By 1905 or so, as you're wearing a slim, straight skirt, you had those ridiculous leg of mutton sleeves that stuck out, like shoulder pads. But as the skirt narrowed, the sleeves got wider, and the inverse had been true before. But the kind of the stereotype of the era was the Gibson girl. She was the kind of an athletic new woman who was going out and doing things more than just being home and visiting and not really contributing to society all that much. But Charles Dana Gibson was the illustrator who created this Gibson girl. He said, "I'll tell you how I got what I have called the Gibson girl. I saw her on the streets, I saw her at the theaters, I saw her in the churches, I saw her everywhere and doing everything. I saw her idling on Fifth Avenue and at work behind the counter of the stores. The nation made the type. What Zangwill calls melting pot of races has resulted in a certain character. Why should it not also have turned to a certain type of face? There isn't any Gibson girl, but there are many thousands of American girls, and for that, let us thank God." As women became more and more active, they were riding bicycles, they were playing tennis, they needed things that they could move into. A lot of this complicated undergarments was replaced with something called a combination, which was obviously a combination of a corset cover or a chemise and the drawers. It was all attached as one thing, so rather than having 6 or 8 pieces, you could narrow it down to just one. So a little easier there again to get around. There was also the introduction of something called a health corset, and I use that term very loosely. It was still a corset, but it was generally more and more commonly to be made of a stretchy fabric rather than something that's boned and tightly laced. Was a little easier to move. They're also generally longer. kind of combining into what became a girdle later. It created what was the silhouette was kind of an S shape rather than something that was totally straight up and down. The gowns started to be a little more informal. They were lace or lawn, didn't have quite as many layers, quite as much fluff. By World War I, the women were obviously working outside the home and really doing things, needed to be practical, was the introduction of masculine kind of details, like pockets, things that were heavier and more practical. Simple straight skirt and a jacket. Also woolen jumpers and sweaters were common for women rather than just a dress. So they're moving into things that were practical and common. Women also started in the 1920s wearing pants. We're delighted about the introduction of pants. After the war, fashion changed again one more time and really never looked back, other than as costume, basically. The 1920s was the flapper. Flappers were even more new women who were advocating for women's suffrage. They were working outside the home. They never really went back. The term for a flapper comes from a baby bird learning to flap its wings. So that's where the word comes from. But Zelda Fitzgerald, who is probably the most quintessential flapper, said, "The flapper awoke from her lethargy of sub-debism, bobbed her hair, put on the choicest pair of earrings, had a great deal of audacity and rouge, and went into battle. She flirted because it was fun to flirt, and wore a one-piece bathing suit because she had a good figure. She covered her face with powder and paint because she didn't need it, and she refused to be bored, chiefly because she wasn't boring. She was conscious of all the things that she did were things she had always wanted to do. Mothers just approved of their sons, taking in the flapper to dance, to tease, to swim, and most of all, to heart. She had mostly masculine friends, but youth does not need friends, it only needs crowds." The popular style at the time was sort of a drop waist, one-piece thing. Hemlines rose at the same time, never really above the kind but just the idea of a dress to the knee was shocking in itself. Didn't really have to go any higher than that. Had a kind of an androgynous silhouette, very flat-chested. Usually the top of the dress was lower in the back than in the front. So if you see a flapper with a V-neck, she's got it on backwards. There was one more change, again something more common. The introduction of what you mostly recognize as a regular slip. Again, to replace all of this with something similar. And then my giant piece de resistance that I like to bring with. The dresses themselves looked like this. This is a 1920s dress, Smart Collection. It does have the hand done beading on it that makes it that fabulous flapper thing. It makes that nice noise when you move it around. So when you were going out to a speakeasy, there were a lot of them in Scranton. You weren't looking for options, but that is what you would have been wearing. And from there, fashions only went to things that seem more and more common. By the 1930s was the introduction. The drawers were replaced with something called tap pants that look very similar to what you buy in the store today as running shorts. But they were the precursors to regular modern underwear. Bras started to appear 1940s, 1950s or so. What's common today, and then of course a lot of this starts to come back. Girdles, there are waist cinchers, and plastic surgery now. So that idea of a fashionable silhouette has never really gone away. Corsets get a lot of flack, but they still exist. You could still get them if you are so inclined. I don't know why you'd want to, but you can. But basically, the point that I'm trying to make with all of this is kind of, what would you rather do? If you were getting dressed in the morning, would you rather start with this, and this, I'm dropping, and this, and this, and this, and a crinoline, and this, and then a dress on top of it? Or you could wear this, and this, and be done. So the idea of it changed. There was always an undergarment layer to it. It just got simpler and simpler and simpler as we went on. So that is the end of my fabulous program. I will leave this here. If you'd like to come up and play with it, you're welcome to. Just be careful with the bustle. There are pokey outy wire bits, so please don't stick yourselves. But thank you very much.
Are they replicas or they date back to that?
They're all original. Yeah, they're all originals. Most of the clothing that we have is original. The only things that we have that are modern reproductions are like the common pieces. We've had to make a black skirt to wear just to have like those everyday pieces. They're the things that we don't have, but all of these are originals. I don't think I brought it. No, there's a simpler bodice corset cover that I have that has the woman's initials embroidered in it. So, but yeah, all the pieces that we have are originals. So does anyone else have any questions? I kind of skipped over questions.
I did. I was wanting
Sure.
to know, like, there were a lot of women who were dressmakers. That was an actual occupation
Yes.
for them then. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. There were, I think, in the Scranton City directories from the 1890s, there were, I don't know how many, but there's like 2 columns of dressmakers that are listed. It wasn't uncommon. Another anniversary thing to celebrate. The Women's Institute of Domestic Arts and Sciences in Scranton was the women's arm of ICS, taught dressmaking, and along with the lessons on dressmaking, they also taught you how to open your own shop. So it wasn't uncommon. It was an easy way to support yourself as a woman, to make clothing for others. Yeah. So, but I will leave this here again when you're done. Please come up and take a look at it. So, thank you again. Carry on.